Welcome back. Well, from Islamists to secularists, from within the country and from outside, there's plenty of opposition to the Syrian government. For years, all these dissidents and opposition members worked separately. But the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri and the charge that Syria was responsible changed all that. The media coverage and attention prompted some of those in exile to put aside their differences and work together. A group representing several factions, all of whom are in exile, has just wrapped up a three-day series of meetings in Brussels. The National Salvation Front, the NSF, was formed last year and brings together some former opponents. For example, the former Ba'athist vice president and the head of the Muslim Brotherhood are both members. Opposition to the Syrian government is far from united. Some argue the only way to bring about change is to put an end to the Assad regime, which has been in power for decades. Others say reform must come from within, that an outright regime change would only bring about chaos and violence. Most of these views are simply not tolerated within Syria. Well, we'd just like to remind our viewers that we made repeated requests to the Syrian government to get their views on the issue, but they declined to comment. So joining us now are Abeda Nahas and Dr. Naguib Al-Gadban, who both attended the opposition meetings in Brussels. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Dr. Al-Gadban, let me start with you first. Syrian opposition groups haven't always been united. So did these meetings in Brussels signal that you're now working together?
Definitely. The formation of the National Salvation Front is a major achievement in the way of uniting different, in fact, groups. As you mentioned, some of them were former enemies, like the former Vice President Crackdown and the Brotherhood. But the NSF is, in fact, much more than these two forces. We have different groups from the US. These are liberal, independent groups. And we have important Kurdish representation in this movement. And along that, we're trying always to coordinate with activists inside, with other opposition figures. Really, I mean, we find ourselves all united in the cause of promoting democratic change, peaceful change, and the respect for human rights. A case like the one you were discussing on your program today unites all Syrians, not just, a few exiled individuals here and there.
Let me bring in Abeda Nahas there, because you haven't always been united, I think that's fair to say. There were reports that some NSF and Muslim Brotherhood members objected to working with former Syrian Vice President Abdul Halim Khaddam as part of the opposition in exile. Is that true?
Definitely not, because if we didn't agree to work with Mr. Khaddam, we wouldn't be sitting in NSF meetings, of course. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria were the first group in exile to welcome the departure of Mr. Khaddam from this regime. In fact, first contact between Mr. Khaddam and the opposition, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, started in 2003. Mr. Khaddam then felt that this regime is unreformable, so he sent a letter of sympathy to the opposition through the Muslim Brotherhood, saying that he is planning to join the opposition when the right time comes. In fact, if you look at the Syrian regime today, and with Mr. Khaddam's departure, we only emphasize, we can emphasize that this is the last regime of its kind in the Arab region today, and it's one of very few regimes that follow this pattern of repression on our earth today, on our planet. It reminds you of the former Eastern European dictatorships, the Saddam Hussein dictatorship. It's very, very rare that you have such defiant regimes today in this world, under this media watch, that sentences all activists. And by the way, the crackdown you were talking about earlier does not only include the few persons you mentioned, it is actually targeting tens of activists who are sometimes unnamed. There are sentences in front of the Supreme State Security Court every week. Some of them are actually sentences of death penalty.
OK, let's just bring in back Dr. Gadban there a second, because you're based in the US and you've met officials in Washington. How receptive has the US administration been to the situation in Syria, do you think?
I think they've been growing more receptive to our demands to include the issue of human rights and democracy on their agenda in dealing with Syria. As Mr. Khouri actually mentioned earlier, that we welcome the developments, in fact, in issuing statement condemning the sentencing of activists, the exposing the false elections that took place very recently. We welcome all of that. We think that's in fact positive development, but we would like them to take more practical steps, especially regarding the EU, which as we speak, in fact, we hear about delegations going to Syria and providing financial support for that country. So we would like to get to the point where both the United States and the EU are in a position, we don't mind if they engage the Syrian regime, but condition that with the improvement of human rights, with encouraging the right of the Syrian people to elect freely their representatives. And in fact, we believe that's the way to reach stability on behalf of the Syrian regime.
Let's just stay with that point about the US government trying to engage with Syria, because they've been trying to talk to the Syrians about the possibility of helping resolve the violence in Iraq, to break the political impasse in Lebanon. But how do you think that will really impact on your talks with the Americans?
I think, again, for us in the U.S., those of us who are activists in the U.S., first of all, we were trying to, again, place that agenda, as I mentioned, on the relationship. When the United States passed the Syrian Accountability Act back in 2003 and was, in fact, completed in 2004, they did not mention anything about human rights, about democracy in Syria, although, as Mr. Nahas mentioned, it's one of the last authoritarian regimes. I mean, this is a regime which still has a clause in the Constitution talking about the Ba'ath Party as the leading party in the state and society. This is something that Gorbachev actually kind of abolished back in 1985 as he started his reform. I think, again, for the U.S., we're trying to make sure that any kind of dealing with Syria should not be at the expense of two issues. First, human rights and democracy in Syria, and second, the international tribunal, because in fact there are connections with these two. And maybe I could may say a word here. I think what the Syrian government, by kind of increasing its crackdown on activists, is trying to prepare itself for what's coming, I think, in the few months in the way of the international tribunal.
Abida Nahas, let me come back to you. How would you sum up the NSF's goals? Do you want to see regime change in Damascus?
Well, in the opposition, we've been trying for 7 years to make some progress. The first 5 years, in our opinion, were wasted because this regime refused to listen to anyone. We called for calm, gradual reform over the first 5 years of Bashar Assad's term in presidency. And in the first few years, he said, I can't do it. Then, once he got the ability, he started cracking down on the opposition. In fact, the whole opposition, all political parties in opposition that I know of, have decided that it's no more useful to call for reform in Syria. And the Damascus Declaration in October 2005 summed up this, and every political party inside and outside the country almost signed that declaration, which called clearly for regime change. Now, we were calling upon the regime to start a serious process of change. If the regime is not willing to do so, then any members of this regime that are willing to join the democratic forces are welcome. And this is why we welcome Mr. Khaddam, and we are welcoming other members of this regime, by the way. Not all of them are announced at the moment, but we are working together with many forces inside and outside the country towards regime. If the top of this regime is not willing to be part of this process, then it's not going to be part of the future of this country, unfortunately. This is why we are working, and we have been working over the last 3 days on reviewing our plans and where we have and how far have we come since we started the NSF last year. And I think we are making a lot of good, achievements.
These recent verdicts bring to 6 the number of government critics who've been convicted and sentenced in the last month. Is this likely to silence the dissent, or is it reinvigorating your movement, do you think?
I think this is just useless, in fact, because the regime has to crack down on 18 million people, in fact, if it wants to end criticism. Let's not forget that just 2 weeks ago, when there were elections in Syria, there was mass boycott of the elections. The participation rate was not more than 4.5% of the whole population. That's a disaster for such a regime. But unfortunately, this regime does not understand that it cannot go against history, against time. All countries, all humanity moves forward, but this regime is going backward. In fact, what we are seeing today reminds us of the 1970s. In the 1990s, under the former president, Hafez al-Assad, we didn't see such bad trials, such bad treatment of prisoners. Things were easing up, but this current president, who is a so-called young president, is actually, reviving the old repression methods. So I think this is not gonna be of any help to this regime's cause. And let's not forget that the last 6 people you were talking about are not the only ones. Let's not forget people like Dr. Arif Dalila, who were jailed in 2001, and he's now in his 70s. And he was only jailed for criticizing corruption in this regime.
All right, let's just go back to Dr. Al Ghadban for a second, because Kamal Labwani has now been jailed for 12 years for allegedly speaking with senior officials in the US about human rights in Syria. Just how dangerous is it for people like you talking to foreign officials in foreign countries?
It's very dangerous. I mean, as you said, when Kamal Labwani visited London and Washington, in fact, he was invited by Amnesty International to London. And when he came to the U.S., we had several meetings prior to his meeting with U.S. officials and afterward. His message to the U.S. officials was twofold. First, he said, we would like the U.S. to support the Damascus Declaration, which was at the time being kind of signed by all political groups, intellectuals, and, most political forces in Syria actually signed into it, from inside and outside. And the second, there were some kind of reports at the time to impose sanctions on Syria because of mentioning the Syrian officials in the, the Hariri assassination. And his message was, if you want to do that, please do not punish the Syrian people. Just go after those who were implicated. And he was very clear. In fact, he appeared on 2 TV shows, one of them on Al-Hurra, on Demokrati. I was with him. And those messages, I mean, those kind of messages might sound to us, those who live in democratic countries, I mean, are normal. In fact, this is expressing your right of expression.
Okay, Dr. Ghadban,
to an authoritarian regime, it's dangerous. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Ghadban, we have to leave it there. Dr. Naguib Al Ghadban and Obida Nahas, both in Brussels, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the entire team here, goodbye for now.